18 to hit, 22 damage. That's a hit, and it kills the last ogre. Easy as pie. We totally dominated. Nice. Yes, it was super exciting. Welcome, Dungeon Hackers. Today we're going to talk about a subject near and dear to my heart, and that is us forever dungeon masters that begin to get bored with combat. Why can't combat be fun for us too? Well, in this video we're going to take a look at the reasons why combat isn't fun and the different things that we can do to make combat more interesting for the dungeon master. Now, the first thing is that most monster stat blocks have very basic attack options. Claw, bite, smash, longsword, bow and arrow, stuff like that. Plus 4 to hit for 8 damage. Not terribly exciting. Let's take a look at the direwolf, for example. Now, the direwolf does have pack tactics, and that gives it a little bit of strategy that it can use. But all of its attacks are simply plus 5 to hit for 8 damage, and you knock the target prone. And that's just not super exciting. Fighting a pack of wolves, every round, the wolf rolls a d20, adds 5, and does 8 points of damage. Attack, hit, 8 points of damage. Repeat ad nauseum. And this leads directly into the second problem, is the repetitiveness. Not only are the attacks very uninteresting, but they're very repetitive as well. For an example of this, let's take a look at a slightly more complicated stat block, the Barbed Devil. Now, the Barbed Devil has barbed hide, dealing damage to creatures that are trying to grapple it. It's got Devil Sight, and it's got magic resistance. Those are some excellent traits. But once the combat starts, it does one of two things. It uses its multi-attack to make 3 melee attacks, 1 with its tail and 2 with its claws, or it hurls flame twice. This is sort of a false choice, because the Barbed Devil is not going to hurl flames when it's in melee, and it's not going to use its claws and tail if it's at ranged. So the Barbed Devil still doesn't have any meaningful decisions to make in combat. If in melee, it just goes claw, claw, bite, and if it's at ranged, it just hurls flame. The amount of damage dealt in both situations is fairly comparable, so there's not a huge motivation to do one or the other. A little bit more damage up close, a little more safety at range. So once again, very repetitive and boring to play in combat. Now, one thing I would like to point out is that some of the new monsters that we've gotten sneak peeks at do have a few more interesting options to use. However, until the monster manual comes out, I'm just looking at the 2014 stuff for the most part. And the next problem is the overpowered players. Now, this is partially our own faults for making the players overpowered by giving them lots of magic items, but it also is part of the design of the system. The superpowered heroes are supposed to breeze through most combats. Most combats aren't really supposed to go super long, and the common wisdom is 3 to 5 rounds at most. But with occasional well-played tactics or well-timed spells, some combats are over before they even begin. Even if you have an exciting, dynamic, multifaceted encounter for the party to fight against, like, say, zombies shambling into a room every couple of rounds with new waves, the party can throw up a wall of force and can nullify the entire encounter before it even begins. So what are the solutions? How do we fix these problems? Well, the first thing is monsters with more viable options. Now, this does make things a little more difficult to run for the Dungeon Master, as you have to decide what the monsters are going to do each turn. But having options is never a bad thing, and as long as you're planning ahead, then you should know what they can do. And in previous videos that have come out recently from Dungeons & Dragons, they've hinted that monsters with multiple options in combat have been balanced a little bit better, so that there isn't always a best path to follow, that you can choose any of their actions, and it will still be a viable, powerful option. But again, we don't have it yet, so we'll have to wait and see. The next thing is that most battles shouldn't be fought in a blank, empty room. You need to have dynamic environments to really make the encounters interesting for you and the players. And we did a video about using encounters previously, and I'll link to that up above, but I'll give you a quick rundown here. Adding things to encounters like fog, cover, traps, shifting sand, even spraying lava can make for a much more interesting combat and a change in tactics by the bad guys as well as the party. This means you aren't just walking up with the monsters and smashing back and forth until somebody's dead. And think about having the monsters interact with the environment in a variety of ways. I once had a kobold den that had traps all over the place, as kobold dens do, and there were pressure plates on the floor. They were fairly obvious, and the party saw them as traps right away. However, the trap was that blades shot across the room 4 feet off the ground. So the kobolds would run around, step on the plates on purpose, triggering these traps. The blades would whirl right over the top of their heads and hit the party members. So make sure that you're getting good use out of the environment, and like I said, check out that video for a lot more information on that. Sometimes taking the suboptimal option for the creatures is more interesting for the story. Remember, you aren't really trying to win and kill the entire party, because that wouldn't be much fun for everybody. So it's okay if you do a few less points of damage in an encounter, but do something interesting with the environment. Imagine an earth elemental that instead of attacking the party, attacks a column, caving in part of the roof. Even if it doesn't do any damage to the party, it really plays into the earth elemental trying to destroy civilization as it encroaches upon its realm. That makes for a more dynamic encounter, perhaps difficult terrain, and the earth elemental is more than just rolling damage. And next, try adding interesting NPCs into the mix. Now, I'm not talking about full-on Dungeon Master player characters, but maybe just creatures or humanoids that don't do what most of the bad guys do. And it doesn't have to be super complicated either. Maybe they've befriended an awakened owl. Now, the owl's not terribly powerful, and the owl can't even do a whole lot. However, it could use its flyby ability and the help action to help the party out. Now, this gives you more to do than just attack, and it makes it a little more interesting for you and the party. Imagine a cowardly villain that doesn't just fight to the end. Perhaps on his turn, he runs for cover. Much like the kobolds in the earlier one, a goblin might disengage and run from the party, triggering other traps and things in the room. Not necessarily on purpose, like the kobolds did, but maybe this sets off an explosion that hurts his other goblin allies. Now, of course, you've always got options to homebrew monsters to make them all more interesting. So remember, interesting monsters and interesting NPCs, as well as dynamic encounters and using the environment, is the best way to really make the encounters interesting for you as well as for the party. If you can't find exactly the right stuff that you need, feel free to homebrew stuff. This is your game after all. And hopefully the new monsters in the monster manual will take care of some of these problems for us. We'll know in a few days. So remember, when you're building a dungeon, it doesn't have to be static and boring, because you can keep on hacking the dungeon.